So let's get started. Share this. Okay, you should be able to see my screen. Okay. All right, so today we're going to talk about the kind of just overall understanding the key differences between animal proteins and plant proteins. There's a lot of discussions in this conference about, plant-based diets and then kind of some subtle nuances between, keto, paleo, Mediterranean, high fat, low fat, those kind of things. But what I want to talk about today is just the simple basic understanding of certain questions that you need to be asking yourself. And this is what I sit with my patients who I see for the last 25 years. And I present them with evidence-based information and trying to explain to them, educate them, and empower them at the very end of the day of how we need to transition ourselves into a more of a plant-based diet as much as possible because we're looking at reversing and preventing and treating all diseases as much as we can, making food medicine. So let's get started. My name is Dr. Sunil Pai. I am the founder of House of Sanjevani Integrative Medicine Health and Lifestyle Center here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And also just letting you know for the time of this conference, my book here, Inflammation Nation, is on sale. You can get a signed copy now. Just go to sanjevanistore.com, or you can even get it on Amazon. And also our Bosmeric.com. We'll have our Bosmeric also on sale, which I'll be speaking about tomorrow more in detail for those who want to learn more about natural anti-inflammatories and how to learn about the differences. So let's get started. So first and foremost, I want to say that we're redoing our podcast. It's becoming a brand new upgraded feature. So please sign up at sanjevani.net or sanjevanistore.com. Sign up, get on our newsletter list because it's going to be a wonderful experience for you to listen to regularly of getting evidence-based information. We'll do deep dives with interviews and research. And also we're going to be doing some shorts and just some quick tips and factoids that you can take every day so that you can start learning how to take back your health. So most of us, as we're listening to this conference, or more importantly, when we're on the news, we're watching the news or reading social media, for example, we're just getting tired of misinformation, right? Every time you read something, I'll say, eat this, but not that, for example. And again, the diets are all over the place. And so today I really want to get to the basics. If you learn the basics, then you can apply those principles to anything. And so no matter what you hear on the news or from social media or influencers or even some of the providers on these channels or on these videos, we want to look at like, can you apply this basic understanding? And if you understand it, then the rest of this misinformation will kind of just dissipate and fall aside because you want to know where will you be standing at the end of the day when it makes healthier choices in terms of coming that to with your diet. So first and foremost, in my book, I'm just going to cover a few slides again. I know you've probably seen this before, but we're looking at inflammation. Inflammation is the key triggering mechanism of all diseases. Again, dietary lifestyle changes, which I've talked before. My book goes into much greater detail. And for those who are interested, I actually did a whole lecture on The Real Truth About Health about an Inflammation Nation, the top 10 steps that you need to do to help prevent, treat, and reverse all diseases. And more importantly, I've talked many other times about the stacking effects of inflammation, food sensitivities, the top 3 tests that doctors should be using in their practice to help you achieve optimum health, and a variety of other lectures that I've provided. But today, we're going to get into the idea of inflammation and looking at the diet and how we affect inflammation. Now, we know that inflammation, again, triggering mechanism of all diseases now, and there's the inflammatory component of the disease. So it's not the cause of the disease, but it makes every disease condition worse. And, the suffix itis, its, just means, coming from the root word flam or fire, just means inflammation of that area. And we do need a little bit of amount of inflammation in the body. Here I have a couple of pictures like a kitchen and a living room and a bed. We need a little bit of heat. We need a little temperature. It is regulating certain biological functions in the immune system, and just that almost every system is regulated in a positive and a negative effect with having inflammation. But when it's uncontrolled, like you see here in the bottom, you see this kind of kitchen fire, the house on fire, your bed's burning, then there's too much inflammation. And inflammation just is leading us to have chronic diseases. So if we have a normal knee and we get inflammation of that knee, we get arthritis. If we have a normal colon, we have inflammation over time, we get colitis. Heart disease, which is a pro-inflammatory condition, eating high animal protein and saturated fats, pro-inflammatory foods, which I'll talk about in detail. And then now we're looking at all the neurological diseases like Alzheimer's, dementia diseases. All of these are all coming from having inflammation in the brain. And we know that too much inflammation also increases the role of aging. So we actually kind of, the oxidative stress of inflammation now and low nutrients in the diet actually causes us to live a shorter lifespan. And so when we look at, these itis conditions, there's over 200 different itis conditions. So again, arthritis, dermatitis, conjunctivitis from your eyes, runny nose, rhinitis, sinusitis, gingivitis, laryngitis, sore throat, thyroiditis, bronchitis, esophagitis, gastritis, colitis, prostatitis, vaginitis. There's 200 different medical diagnoses now using this itis or inflammatory issue. The main focus from an integrated perspective is not just treating each individual disease separately, but looking at going to the root cause of why we are having this dysfunction, this imbalance, or more importantly, at the end of the day, some of these now turning into diseases, right? Inflammation runs from head to toe. And so just like the Macarena of the hokey pokey, just turn yourself around. That's what it's all about. We have it almost everywhere in the body, some of us more than others. In my book and in other lectures, you can listen to why that is and where inflammation likes to go. But inflammation also, aside of chronic degenerative diseases, also increases rates of cancer, right? So we know that, colon having inflammation there over 10 years or so, 20 years or no, and now 35 years or so, we increase, almost half of those patients will end up having a colon cancer. Active rheumatoid arthritis, which is an inflammatory condition, autoimmune, which we'll have a whole discussion later on if you want about that. But that will contribute to having people having a 71-time higher rate of getting lymphoma, a type of cancer. Even viruses like HPV in the cervical tissue can increase in 10 to 20 years, having that turn into cervical cancer. So inflammation not only generates the diseases, but also increases the degeneration of those conditions and risk factors to increase cancer overall. So chronic disease and cancer are pretty much preventable in the majority of all the problems in people that we have on a daily basis. For example, genes right here are only 2 to 3% of disease, even though like you hear about it a lot in the science and the data. Everybody's always talking about genetic therapy, gene therapy, and always blaming their genes. But really, we want to focus on what the 97% is what we can control. And of the things that we can control, cleaning up our environment, getting our immune system stronger. I actually did a lecture in my book. We'll cover a lot of that in detail of how and what you can take to actually strengthen the immune system, right? We want to control our weight. Some of the things I'll talk about today in terms of blood sugar and metabolic function is key with that. Again, avoiding tobacco use at all costs. That includes even vaping. But diet is the largest contributing factor that we have just easy means to change. And so if we can change that along with these other factors, that means we can have better control of our chance of lowering risk of chronic diseases and cancer. So what we are is we're an inflammation nation, as you know, and in fact, my book, as it was written, covering not only the dietary aspects, but the health insurance industry, the dietary supplement industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the environmental toxicities and environmental stressors, the emotional and financial stressors that we're all facing. And now we're talking about even the political stresses that are still, those are all contributing the stacking effects of inflammation. So what are we eating as a country that is so inflamed? The average American's eating, this is about on average, but per day, a pound of animal protein, beef, chicken, pork, fish, eggs, 2 pounds of cheese and dairy products, right? A half a pound of refined flours, 1 pound of vegetables, but 95% of those vegetables are in form of French fries. And ketchup now is, the second most consumed quote unquote vegetable, right? Which is kind of sad to say, but that's what the government now has been classifying ketchup as a vegetable. And they're consuming large amounts of sodas, 18 ounces of soda on average, a third pound of GMO sugar and corn sweeteners, and about an ounce of artificial sweeteners. So this is what the average person is eating. Now, what I want to speak about today is I'm going to present a slide that's going to be coming soon. And that's the slide that, when I see a patient, and I do telehealth conferences, consultations to people all around the world. They can either come in office or we can do it online. And we do health coaching sessions and we do all the testing. We can send the kits and we go into all that in detail. But the idea is like, if you understand this next slide, you need to apply the principles to every day of what you're eating and think about these simple questions. Are you strengthening your body or are you weakening it? Right? Is it increasing inflammation or is it lowering it? Is it causing heart disease or is it reversing it? Is it increasing your risk of diabetes or worsening it or reversing it? Is it disrupting your microbiome or is it strengthening it? Right? Is it increasing your risk of cancer or is it lowering it? Is it kind of speeding up your metabolism or is it slowing down and I'm gaining weight? or is it just full of hive toxins and microplastics? So we're going to get into all of these things, but we want to just start with these basics because at the end of the day, in my practice, I'm not a perfectionist. I'm a risk reductionist. That means I need to reduce my patients' risk of heart disease, diabetes, cancer, stroke, etc. So it doesn't mean that they all have to be 100% perfect. If they do, even better. And their outcomes and their longevity and their quality of life is, the gold standard is what we call it. But for my job and for most people, I want to just move them away from having to wait in line at the emergency room, right? And actually have them being, on a vacation and enjoying their lifespan, right? And not just looking at, oh, I'm trying to treat myself with medications and just treating symptoms all day. So this is the slide. And hopefully, after you watch this, you can come back later or take a screenshot of it. I'm going to be showing this throughout this lecture. But if you understand this slide, then anything else that you see from here on out about nutrition, whether you hear something in the news, whether you hear, again, social media, influencers, and industry lobby groups, which are pushing information, who then these people then produce these videos, both good and bad, right? Everybody has an agenda. You need to apply these principles and say, are you on this side? Are you on a more of a pro-inflammatory side? Or are you on an anti-inflammatory side, right? And we'll go through this specifically today. So first and foremost, we just want to talk about inflammation. Now, again, I have another lecture, have a whole book. You can, get into the deep dive of that. But just looking at inflammation in general, let's just look at simple blood test markers that we track inflammation. Now we know, as I mentioned before, 200 different itis conditions, right? And we can measure those things. We can do biopsies. We actually can say this is the pathology of the disease, right? We can take x-rays and scans and all, but just from simple blood tests, because most people can get simple blood tests. CRP, C-reactive protein, which most of you have heard by now, right? A lot of people use it in cardiology because that was one of the first inflammatory markers that was used simply to check and see if that patient is having a higher level of inflammation or a lower level of inflammation. And with heart disease, the higher inflammation and the higher the level of the cholesterol and LDL and triglycerides, for example, then that was kind of a double whammy. That was the trifecta, as we call, of inflammation and lipids, kind of increasing the risk of having the heart attack or stroke. CRP goes up when you eat animal protein. IL-1, IL-6, IL-12, IL-17, and TNF alpha. Any of you who have heard or have a friend or a family member that has an quote autoimmune disease, rheumatoid, a colitis, psoriatic arthritis, and every day on television you'll see another inflammatory autoimmune disease because autoimmune diseases are increasing exponentially. But we have to see, like, well, what are we doing? We give what they call TNF alpha blockers, right? These are these biologics that they give. These are expensive infusions that have a lot amount of side effects. But what they're doing is they're blocking one of the main switches. And my book will cover this more in detail. And even tomorrow when I talk about Bosmeric as a natural anti-inflammatory to lower TNF alpha naturally through 4 different spices and herbs, that can do that naturally. But TNF alpha is increased with animal protein. So when people take Remicade, Humira, Enbrel, you'll hear of all these different types. There's dozens that are coming out on the market almost on a weekly basis. We introduce one more biologic into the conventional panacea of treatment of inflammatory and autoimmune diseases, is that animal proteins over here just increase them, right? So before we talk about, people say, well, how is it inflammatory? Well, just check your blood. If you have these elevated, and eat less of it. Plant proteins, on the other hand, actually have been shown, which we all know, to decrease it. But the simple thing is just decreasing the animal protein, decreasing the entire aspect of inflammatory markers. So if you go to your doctor and your CRP is elevated and you're taking Remicade or Enbrel or Humira or any other of these other biologics, or they say, yeah, you have an inflammatory component to your disease or imbalance or dysfunction, then you want to be eating more of the foods that are anti-inflammatory in general, right? So you want to be pushing for that. And if you do, I can say with strong confidence that your numbers will get better. The problem is that since we don't, in terms of the system, conventionally, most docs don't tell people to eat correctly. They just say, hey, just show up every month and get your infusion. Or we even get alternative providers say, well, eat more of this and then let's give you your alternative medicine infusion, right? They're still both doing you a disservice. You need to be eating foods that decrease inflammation. Now, when we look at omega-3s and omega-6s, we know that we want more omega-3s and we want less omega-6s. So let's start with understanding a little bit about both. Okay, so in my book, I talk about, and there's probably been lectures on this conference looking at omega-3s and omega-6s. So in general, omega-6s are more pro-inflammatory in the body, although you need some. And omega-3s are anti-inflammatory, and we need a lot more. Okay, now when we look at omega-6s, where we get omega-6s, even in the plant-based world, and those people who eat plants, is too much in the oils, right? The fried foods, right? And most of us, especially depending on where you live, but there's certain places in America where they're like even double deep frying a Twinkie, for example, right? So some things are just overly use of oil, right? Now, we're not also talking about the other faction or the other radical side of this where people saying you have no oil in the diet, right? Because that can also cause problems. But in general, the average person is having too much omega-6s. Omega-6s comes from animal proteins, which is meat and dairy in general, and then highly, the refined oils, right? So they're frying foods. And there's usually a combination. We're eating a bucket of this with French fries, for example, or cheeseburger and bacon cheeseburger with French fries, for example, okay? But high omega-6 foods increases what they call arachidonic acid, and that's a pro-inflammatory pathway in the body. And so when we take drugs that try to block this, Vioxx, Celebrex, Motrin, Advil. I have a whole lecture on why you shouldn't take NSAIDs, and I'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow. And then we give, rather than something that's natural and safer to lower that, right? Bosmeric is the example, but these are high pro-inflammatory triggering foods. So if we even measure omega-3s and omega-6s, which we do with all our patients, when they come in, we do a nutrition test, and we actually show if they're having an inflammatory problem, if their diagnosis has an itis, and I see that they're having high omega-6s in their diet, they have to reduce that. But interesting enough, everybody, even my plant-based patients or patients who are eating more plant-forward or even Mediterranean, we're not getting enough omega-3s, right? And we need to eat more of these omega-3s. This is flax, chia, hemp, and walnuts, right? This provides you the omega-3s. Now, interesting enough, in my book, for those people who are interested, I did, and I was involved in, this is like over 10 years ago, the first project which brought in plant-based omega-3s, both EPA and DHA, from a sustainable source, right? And that was actually a Canadian company that created that gold standard now. So you see a lot of now vegan omega-3s, right? It used to just only come from fish. But what we really want to look at is that the industry, and even when I was consulting for these big companies, is that they would always sell both on the fish oil industry and in the plant oil industry that people can't convert their omega-3s. But we actually test that in our patients. We actually put it to the test, as some doctors will say a lot, is that we will look at, does the person have delta 6 desaturase enzyme activity? And if it's functional, if it's working, then if they eat these foods, they actually convert and they make their omega-3s. They don't need a dietary supplement at all, right? And there's a lot of plant-based doctors even push dietary supplements of plant-based oils. And not that it's bad, but if we can actually get it and measure it and say, hey, you actually can just get it from your diet if you eat more of these foods, why wouldn't you eat these foods? Right? So we have to be eating more omega-3s and less omega-6s. The omega-3s are anti-inflammatory. The EPA helps lower inflammation. And more importantly, for those people who have cardiovascular disease, it helps with lowering your cholesterol, helps with lowering your triglycerides, and it helps lowering your LDL, helps with lowering inflammation because it's an anti-inflammatory omega-3 fatty acid. And the DHA is good for your brain and memory health, right? So we all in America would definitely need to have more of this. Now, omega-6s, we need a lot less of these. We're eating way too much, right? It's pro-inflammatory meat and dairy. And then going from the vegetable side, again, I'm never biased on one thing. We evaluate everything, we call it like it is. There's too much fried foods in America, right? There's too much snack foods in America, right? Ultra processed grains also are high omega-6s. So when we're getting things out of a car window, a fast food item, it's going to be a little bit of this and a lot of this all mixed together, right? So we're having the meats and the dairy and the cheeses. We're also having the fried, Frito type corn chips and, heavy vegetable oils, right? All these things are causing people to have a lot of inflammation. Now, a lot of people will say, what about omega-3s from salmon, sardines, and mackerel? I see patients, and actually I've seen doctors and celebrities, I've gone to conferences, I've gone to like fancy dinners and buffets and all, and I see people actually bring their can of, sardines and, like little mackerel and sardines and like, oh, I'm getting my omega-3s and my protein and all. The problem with this is the following, is that although, fish does have omega-3s, don't get me wrong, that's where they're getting the fish oil from, right? Is that there's no fiber in fish. There's no phytonutrients, and I'm going to explain that more in detail. and it still has cholesterol. So if you have a cholesterol problem and you're on a Mediterranean diet, guess what? Your lipids are still not going to be lower than you expect, right? It's full of toxins, toxins such as PCBs, PUFAs, forever chemicals, dioxins, and heavy metals. If you don't know what those words are or those acronyms, definitely you need to stop this film after you watched it and Google those things because our water, our ocean, and our tap water is full of these things now due to environmental toxicities. Microplastics, which I'll talk about in a little bit at the end of this lecture. And again, most of the fish that people, even when they think is wild caught, is still actually factory farmed. I have a whole section in my book for those people who are really hardcore fish people, like, oh my God, I gotta get my salmon. It's gonna come from this fishery, or oh, I'm buying wild caught salmon oil from omega-3s. You're gonna be surprised at what you find out about that industry. And I've kind of been really heavy on exposing that misinformation. And the only reason I know that is because I was consulting for a lot of these industries, and I just felt it was my duty to actually, kind of speak the truth. Even though I'm being paid to say, to get my information and my expertise for them, I also have to explain to the rest of the industry of consumers what is actually happening and how they're being played on the use of fish and fish sources. So we need more omega-3s at the end of the day. Omega-3s are anti-inflammatory, right? And again, if you have an issue with foods or if you have an issue with food sensitivities, we'll talk about that later. I did a whole section on that as well in the past. But yeah, we can still have inflammation from plant foods and food sensitivities. That's one of my specialty areas, looking at immediate and delayed reactions from foods. So yes, there's going to be certain foods that each person can be tested for that is on the plant side, in the plant kingdom, right? A vegetable, grain, or seed or nut can still cause some inflammation from an immune perspective. But we're just looking at the overall nutritional aspect, and plant foods are anti-inflammatory for most people, except if they have some sensitivities. And those sensitivities can be overcome by rotation diets, by the way. So more omega-3s is what's needed. And again, walnuts, flaxseed, hemp seeds, chia seeds, edamame are great, simple, easy sources. But not only do they have the omega-3s, they have protein, they have fiber, and they have phytonutrients, right? So when people actually even take it from the oil, whether it's from fish or even from a plant, they're not getting protein from it, they're not getting fiber, and they're not getting the phytonutrients, right? So we definitely want to be eating more of this. Now, why are people eating so much omega-6s? There's this huge, in my book covers in detail, because I covered the kind of the generational changes that's happening every 10, 15 years, is that we're increasing more and more omega-6s, right? In 2012, it was one of the worst. But right now, it's about for every omega-3 that an American consumes, we're consuming 20 times more omega-6s. And sometimes, and this is we're looking at the average, and this was looking at the some of the states that are the worst in the United States, it was up to 70 times, right? So 3 times was the worst average right now. There's some states that people are just, again, double frying everything and they're eating high animal protein diets. So just omega-6 is all they're getting. Now, why is that? It's because food is cheap. Now, again, food is getting more expensive now politically and tariffs and whatnot, right? And the cost of food is going up, but America still has the cheapest food overall. And then we are able to consume a bucket of chicken or, a whole box of food for a couple of bucks. And that is just cheap omega-6s. It's all meat, dairy, ultra processed grains, and fried products in there, right? And if you want to know more about insurance companies and some of those other aspects, definitely take a look at the book because they'll open your eyes on who's invested, meaning your insurance company, in the food companies that are selling you the foods that make you sick. They're also then increasing your premiums and then selling you drugs and healthcare plans for treating a disease that they're also participating in and are complicit in. So going back to this slide, right? So we said, okay, anti-inflammatory, pro-inflammatory. We said, okay, animal protein has high omega-6s, and we need to eat more omega-3s, which we get from plants, and they're the healthiest, cleanest part of it. But now let's look at cholesterol and heart disease, okay? So animal protein has cholesterol and plants don't. So the number one cause of death in the world and the number one cause of death in the United States is heart disease. Okay. And on this program, you'll see the real truth about health. There's a lot of wonderful cardiologists, and they've been probably talking for hours on just this topic, right? That animal protein has cholesterol and saturated fat. That is what actually causes the atherosclerotic plaque that actually then starts to narrow your vessels, and what eventually causes a heart attack. When people have strokes, again, this is like a little angiogram of the neck and the head, and you can see here the vessels here are clogged. We shouldn't be seeing this. This should be clear. This is all being filled right now of plaque. That person ends up having um, a stroke, right? And here's an interesting thing. A lot of people think of heart disease, and we should, but then, 60% of my practice is cancer patients. And I was recently at a conference, evidence-based conference, recently, CME conference, and an oncologist came up and started presenting some interesting data. And they asked all the 800 doctors at this conference in Washington, D.C., they said, what's the number one cause of death in a cancer patient in the last 5 years of all the patients that are in the United States that are tracked, right, by the insurance companies and the government, right? In the last 5 years, the number one cause of death of cancer patients is not cancer, surprisingly, because most people think, oh my God, I have cancer. That's the thing I might die from. No, actually, we're doing pretty good. Now, there's a whole discussion on approach of cancer and getting people to get less side effects, and that's what we're really good at is improving outcomes using evidence-based therapies, some of them that are synergistic and complementary to using conventional therapies. But the number one cause of death of cancer patients is heart disease, because heart disease is number one. Whether you have number two disease, number three disease, number four disease, if you have any of the top 15 diseases in America, you'll die from number one because number one is the number one cause. So it's kind of shocking because a lot of times people get through their cancer care and one of my patients, unfortunately, she actually had a brain tumor, stage 4 glioblastoma. Long story short, I think I might have wrote it a little bit in my book, but when we kind of changed her diet, we looked at everything from an integrated perspective, and we looked at all the evidence that is being used in the literature. She survived 12 years, more than what anybody else could think of. I was even surprised, by the way, right? We're just following the data. It's like following the data. You get science is science. It's like you have to develop this idea of taking out ego and sometimes our opinion or personal beliefs and look at, well, what is the data? And we have to shift. I wasn't plant-based always. It was until 2006 that I made this transition because after looking at all the data and looking at all the research, I was like, well, why would I want to put myself at higher risk? I want to lower the risk, right? And unfortunately, although she lived, 12 years, stage 4 recurrent of the brain tumor, which is fantastic. She died of heart disease, right? And at that time, again, because we kind of lose track when someone has cancer that, hey, we want to look at, make sure they don't have recurrence. So, hey, we want to make sure we look at their scans, their cancer markers, circulating tumor cells, all of that. But we forget to look at the number one cause because sometimes, like, well, hey, they can kind of go back to eating whatever because we're over the cancer, right? No, we always got to be on guard. We always got to be eating this anti-inflammatory diet, and heart disease will sneak up on everybody. Now, plant foods have no cholesterol. So this is, as you can see, and I think even the doctor here who's filmed this is speaking at this conference, but they can show, and we have patients that we have actually cleared their 3-vessel disease on a heart transplant list just by changing them over to a complete plant-based diet. There's other things that we would give in addition, but it will reverse the coronary plaque. Usually in a year, we can do it in short of 6 months, but if they're really hardcore with the diet and they follow other lifestyle practices, it improves perfusion of the heart, right? So the interesting thing is drugs don't do that. Statins don't do that. PCSK9 inhibitors don't really do that. They lower the levels, don't get me wrong. Like we can give a statin, it will lower someone's cholesterol level, but that does not reverse the disease that's still progressing even when they're taking the drug. So you want to be shifting more towards a plant-based diet, especially if you want to avoid the number one cause of death. Now, antioxidants and phytonutrients. Antioxidants are low in animal protein. There's no phytonutrients in animal protein. I'll explain that. And antioxidants and phytonutrients are very high and very rich in plant proteins. So when we look at animal protein in general, if you just look at them, and like you can already tell, right? They don't have this kind of rich color. They're kind of dull. It's just, it's dead flesh, basically. That's what it is. But they're lower in antioxidants. Now, granted, there's always going to be this argument in a subsection of my patients, and there's also these practitioners who are pushing, we eat clean food, we're getting grass-fed, wild-caught, free range. That is higher in antioxidants than, say, they go to the big box store and they're getting just, or the Walmarts and the Costco's, and they're like, oh well, I get mine, at Whole Foods, or I'm going to the local butcher shop and it's grass-fed. But where's that animal getting those high antioxidants from? And phytonutrients from our plants. So why don't you just take out the middleman, number one? Okay. Now, Is the grass-fed, wild-caught, and free-range going to have a little bit higher antioxidants than the regular factory farm food? Absolutely. But here's the reality. 99% of animal protein that is processed and served and eaten in the United States is factory farmed. It is not wild caught. It is not grass fed. It's not free range. Okay. So the reality is that people have this perception they might go get a grass fed steak. Then there's differences between grass fed and grass fed finished. For those who want to know all that subtle nuance of why they might be sold and think that they're getting something that's actually maybe potentially a little bit healthier, but it's not, definitely read the book because that's going to be a whole section on that kind of smoke and mirrors. Okay. But it's very low in antioxidants. Now, phytonutrients, there's no phytonutrients, there's no color. And I'll talk about why that's important. But just from a simple standpoint, when we look at foods, you have to sit back and say, hey, when I went to see my doctor, my naturopath, my chiropractor, my MD, or my specialist, did they ever give me a pill that was made from chicken? No. Pork? No. Fish? No. Dairy? No. Eggs? No. Beef? No lamb. They never gave me a pill from that that is preventing, reversing, or treating a disease, right? So a lot of people think, I need to have this, right? I need to have this. But then when we're giving medicines, those medicines are from plants, right? Now we make them synthetic, right? But even, when we look at antioxidants and phytonutrients, they all come from plants. So let me talk about that. Plant protein, super high in antioxidants, but even higher in phytonutrients, right? So you can just see all this color. Going back here, like this, as you can tell, there's no color, no phytonutrients, phyto meaning plant, right? So these are all the amazing colorful compounds. Now, when we think of, and anybody does research looking at heart disease, you look at diabetes, you look at Alzheimer's disease, you look at cancer, regardless of what type of cancer you have, all you'll hear when you see things that are reversing, slowing cancer cell progression, changing cancer cell metabolism, strengthening immune system, strengthening your microbiome, carotenoids, beta-carotene, lycopene, lutein, zeaxanthine, flavonoids, anthocyanins, isoflavones, catechins, all the sulforaphanes, all the resveratrol and curcumins. These are all phytonutrients. There's none of those in animal proteins and saturated fats, right? So it's funny because you'll see a lot on the internet, especially in the last 10 years, social media influencers, cancer survivor celebrities, and these what I call pseudo doctors that are promoting, more of a paleo keto diet, trying to make it cleaner. And then they will sell you an antioxidant formula, a green drink, a red drink, and a fiber supplement. Right. And you all probably seen it. I see it all the time in my feed. It's like, oh, eat like this because, plant foods are bad and you need to eat more protein. And then, yeah, but here's my fiber, here's my antioxidant pill, here's my phytonutrient pill, right? But you should be actually eating it. Most of the medicines that we give that prevent, reverse, and treat disease come from these things, right? And so you have to look at, like, instead of just going to eat them, what we do with our patients, by the way, is that when we test them, the test will tell us then, what you might be low or deficient in. And then we look at whether they have a sensitivity to that food or not, whether that's something that they can add to their diet just by food wise, because you want the full whole food as much as possible, right? And then supplements are supplementing the diet. They're not replacing the diet. But if I have a patient that has, for example, cancer or chronic disease, I have to avoid redundancy. Most people are, for example, taking a vitamin C and their vitamin C levels are great because they're already eating vitamin C rich foods. What you want to be doing is you want to be testing, adding foods back into the diet that are deficient, and then supplementing to fill in the gaps. Supplements should be finding targeted areas of the body, which is what we're good at doing, is looking at, especially with the cancer patient, is targeting the pathways that we just can't get with eating the foods or that we need more of to get a pharmaceutical effect. But most people come in my office, they're taking at least 10, sometimes 20 supplements, about 8 to 10 pharmaceutical drugs, right? That's the average person walking in, and they're not feeling good. And their disease is not under control. And they're sick and tired of being sick and tired, right? But the idea is that if they're taking something, they're eating something, then we want to avoid the redundancy. You need to be putting your money where your food is, and then you need to be targeted by having some guidance, which we help provide, of giving those nutrients that are helpful at reversing, preventing, and treating diseases. So next we want to look at the microbiome. The microbiome is everything, okay? There's more research right now. We're just at the tip of the iceberg of understanding microbiome. An interesting thing is that when we look at microbiome, we have to look at how we're feeding it. Because a lot of these people who are saying paleo, keto, or cleaner food is that they just don't understand microbiome. Because you just can't just eat a couple of vegetables and have a heavy animal protein diet, even if it's cleaner, and say that you're supporting a microbiome. You're not. And in fact, there's no fiber in animal protein or saturated fats, even though in the data and the questions that have been given out there in the last 10 years, 10 to 30% of the population actually think that there's fiber in animal protein. So there's like a huge misconception. There's none, zero, nada, none, absolutely zero, right? So this is a big problem because it's just that basic understanding. And some of these people are doctors, by the way, right? So like, I'm not just blaming the public, like the people who should be educating the public, which are practitioners. But remember, most people didn't get, maybe a few hours of nutrition in the medical school. I was lucky enough. I actually thought it was weird because a lot of my other colleagues, from other schools made fun of me. But my school, we actually had a whole semester of nutrition, right? Because nutrition was important for us and where I went to school because it was a way of what we considered public health being a priority, especially when you live in a place or you live in a country or here in the United States, you can live in a state that's very poor. Right. And we don't have access. We don't have a Mayo Clinic in our backyard, for example. And so we have to be dependent on making food medicine, right? We just can't just send someone to the, top facility. And most people, depending on where you live, and most people live in rural America, we don't live right next to the, a big hospital facility. We have to be pushing more of nutrition and prevention. So when we look at dysbiosis, endotoxins, LPS, and, increasing unfriendly bacteria, this is coming higher in animal proteins and just the opposite. Your whole gut is feeding wonderfully with plant-based proteins. So let's take a look at fiber. What is fiber? So there's soluble and insoluble fiber, and there's two different types, but it comes from eating a variety of plant foods. All plant foods have fiber, right? It kind of creates the bulk in the stool. It actually helps movement, the peristalsis of your gut. It lowers inflammation, right? So just studies on just increasing fiber in the diet by eating plant foods, aside of all the phytonutrients, aside of all the antioxidants, aside of all the wonderful things I'm going to talk about today, it lowers inflammation, lowers blood sugar. So if you have diabetes or you have insulin resistance, increasing fiber slows down glucose rising from the meal that you're eating, right? And when people are eating ultra refined processed foods and sugar and all these animal protein, it's just like spikes their blood sugar because there's zero fiber. Right. So then they're just taking all this kind of what I call garbage nutrients and it jacks their blood sugar up. Right. And then they get this insulin resistance and diabetes problem. And if you have a cholesterol problem, you want to be eating the fiber. And in fact, there's drugs that they give to help bind the cholesterol, but you just need to be eating more of the fiber to help take that out. One thing that we do with our patients, just letting you know, is that some people, 90% of the people that have a cholesterol problem, okay, which is most of everybody in America, has too much intake. Okay. But then 5% are actually super producers. We actually test that. Is their body producing? And then there's a little bit of a genetic component. It's like, yeah, my levels are high. And even if they're plant-based, if they're a super producer and their body's producing more, we still have to give them natural therapies to lower it down. Right? Because it's always about risk reduction. It's not about perfection, it's about reduction. It's about reducing your risk of dying from the number one cause of death, which is heart disease, right? And then there's another 5% of people are actually what they call super absorbers. Their body actually absorbs in the small intestine more fats than normal. So I got patients who are even plant-based. They eat a little bag of kettle potato chips, for example, right? It could be organic for all that matters. And they can have a cholesterol of 300. Right. So we have to understand, like, but how do they lower that level? Is lowering the intake, but also increasing more of the soluble fiber in their diet rather than taking like a drug like cholestyramine or anything like that, or any kind of blocker. And you just want to help that bind. The fiber will bind the cholesterol. And so if we're eating cholesterol, even with a heavier, rich, or fattier food, then that's one way to help lower some of that absorption. Now, more importantly, for those people who are pushing paleo and keto diets, or, you need to eat animal protein, what they don't understand, because again, the understanding of microbiome is very limited in terms of it hasn't been really totally understood until more recently, where again, we're at the tip of the iceberg. We're learning more and more every day. But the gut bacteria, the 4 pounds of over 1,000 species of probiotics that you have, okay, they actually consume fiber to produce what they call short chain fatty acids. This is their energy. It's like the CoQ10 of your gut. This energy in turn turns into what they call butyrate. And the butyrate then improves your body's ability to detoxify. It is the cellular energy that the microbiome utilizes. So when people eat a low fiber diet, and they're eating high animal protein, which is constipation in America, then they increase all these pro-inflammatory triggers. The body can't break down and digest it. That's why it still sits in the colon. That's why people have constipation, and that's why people are taking supplements and Miralax and fiber products and stool softeners because they're just not getting enough of the healthy natural products that have fiber that actually feed their bacteria. Okay, it improves the healthy microbiome. It lowers the infections. I'll talk about that next. It maintains the gut barrier. I'll talk about that next. And it improves dangerous hormones and toxins from the body. And in fact, I was just reading a study yesterday showing that when people eat oatmeal, right? Which is fiber, but also a certain type of fiber product called beta glucans, which I've done a lecture before on this program, looking at, we give something called glucan 300. That's more for your immune system. We're looking at kind of strengthening your immune system. But beta glucans are coming from oatmeal, barley's another one, and mushrooms, right? But if someone eats about a cup of oatmeal a day, for forever chemicals, most of you have heard of PUFAs and PUFOs, right? Those are the things in the pans that we're not supposed to be using, but it's on all sorts of retardants and things that are like waterproof and clothing and materials, and that all washes in the waterways. It's even found in fresh streams in the mountains, so it's everywhere around the world. We see forever chemicals, higher concentration in animal proteins, but when they study it in patients, the average person will have forever chemicals for at least 5 years in their body from the exposure. It takes 5 years to get out. And in the studies, when they gave patients more fiber, particularly that had higher beta glucan content, in those patients, it reduced that level in their body 60% in 3 months. Now, how impressive is that? We want to clean up the water. Unfortunately, they took out the Clean Water Act last week, which is a disaster. So we want to make sure the water is reverse osmosis or have some kind of special filtration system, which unfortunately is disparaging because not everybody can afford these things or have the access to that, but that is what we need. But we also need to be eating some of these foods, more importantly, because if not, we are bioaccumulating those kind of toxins, and then they have higher risks of cancer and other dysfunctions, right? And it modulates the immune function, right? Because again, as I mentioned before, beta glucans, which are in some of these natural foods, right? When we kind of take it out and we standardize them, we can actually modulate the immune system even more if they need to have that support. So what fiber does, this is kind of a simple diagram, but here's your liver. Everything that you eat goes through that master filter, right, after digestion. And then again, as it goes through, again, the bile salts that it comes from the gallbladder, it binds to all these fats, it binds to all the toxins, and then you excrete it out. But if you have a low fiber diet, which is most of America, by the way, it's called enterohepatic circulation. It's a recycling. So when people are constipated, why the stools get really, really hard, and they're trying to, they're trying to take a softener. They got to take, all these kind of lubricants like Miralax, which is actually a de-icer of a plane, basically, polyglycol, whatever, 3399. Those are just things that, are lubricants, by the way. When the stool gets harder, what's happening is the body's recycling. It's reconcentrating all the toxins and all the materials. So if someone's eating a pro-inflammatory diet, and also we're getting exposed to toxins, which is everybody, unfortunately, and they also have food sensitivities, which most people will have, and they're constipated, then this inflammation is going over and the toxicity is going over and over, around and around and around and around. So this increases more inflammation, more chronic disease, higher risk of cancer. Animal proteins have no fiber. So chicken, beef, pork, dairy, salmon, wild caught, free range, grass fed, no fiber. So again, here's the interesting fact is that 95%. So when you hear something like 95%, that's a lot, right? In America, we're lucky if we can get 50% of anybody to agree upon anything. And we're lucky in even politics when say 60% or 70% agree on something, that's a huge majority. We're talking about 95%. 95% of Americans right now do not consume the daily recommended amount of fiber, which is 30 grams or more, right? So when I see all these patients like, I'm eating clean, although I eat this, and I eat tons of vegetables, and then we test their microbiome, it's easy to show. It's like, you're not. Because when you consume animal protein, especially on the amounts that the average person is doing, 100 to 120 grams of animal protein a day, which is crazy. It's the cause of most of their problems, right? You can't add more to your diet than that. So a lot of people say, well, I have my wild caught salmon and have some asparagus, or I have some steamed broccoli, or I have my grass-fed chicken and I had a kale salad. That's not close to 30 grams. And so even in my plant-based patients, by the way, so I'll be fair here, we're not eating enough either, right? Because we haven't been trained to. When we first kind of transitioned to plant-based diet, we took off all this animal protein, but we didn't fill our plate to fill the amount of food that we needed to eat. Only plant foods have fiber. But when we eat animal protein, we get full, and therefore it's very hard for anybody to eat animal protein and still get 30 grams of fiber. I have not really met maybe a few people in the last 25 years that can do that, because the amount that we eat of animal protein just supersedes. The gut gets full. It's just the body's like, okay, I'm done. I can't stretch my stomach anymore. So they can't get enough fiber. And that's why they end up taking fiber supplements, unfortunately, because they need to have that extra support. Now, endotoxins. So endotoxins are different toxins that are microbes. Okay, these are different types of bacteria that are in the animal protein. And we're not just talking about it like it's uncooked. We're not talking about, okay, it was spoiled. We're talking about when you get even grass-fed, wild-caught, free-range, you get the animal protein and we cook it. We boil it. And then it goes into your stomach acid, which is a pH of 1 to 2, right? Super acidic, right? So these are all the things that kill bacteria, right? It contributes and causes what we call dysbiosis and imbalances in the gut. So when you hear this word SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, that is contributed to and by endotoxins in the body. Bacterial dysbiosis. So when people have overgrowths of different type of bacteria in their gut, right, which is common now, and we test that, by the way, we can see like, okay, does this person have any kind of SIBO? If they have bloating issues, if you're feeling that your stomach's flat, and by the end of the day, it feels like you're pregnant, you're Santa Claus, you got to unbutton your dress or your pants, and you're feeling your stomach pooching out, you definitely might have some kind of SIBO issue. You should have it tested. We can help you with that. Those people have gas or bloating, diarrhea, constipation issues. They can have people have chronic antibiotics treatments, or even got, a viral infection or bad foodborne illness. These are things that are common now. Foodborne illness is so common, for example. And when I wrote my book, it was a third of the population has foodborne illness once a year, and then it went to 2/3 of the American population. And then about 3 months ago, before all of this craziness, they actually took out the counting of foodborne illness in America because it's so common. Now they expect every American to have foodborne illness one time at least minimally a year, right? And now they've deregulated food regulations, so we're going to see even more what we call foodborne illness, right? This is like Listeria, E. coli, Salmonella, all this stuff like that. But only those things come from animal proteins, and then those things also get leached out in the waterways into the farms of even the plant food. So then we're all getting collateral damage from that exposure. But when we see candida overgrowth, the yeast overgrowth, and even parasites, these are all coming from endotoxin exposure as one of the causes and contributing dysfunctions in the microbiome. And more importantly, when we see increased intestinal permeability or leaky gut, these are contributing factors. So here's an interesting thing. There's a lot of doctors who, rightfully so, will treat SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and they're good. And they have good protocols. And, we follow the science and like, okay, that's great. You can use a prescription or you can use natural antimicrobials. We want to provide less collateral damage, so let's move forward more towards some of the natural. However, they put them and move them to a low FODMAPs diet. You probably heard of FODMAPs diet. And they're saying, well, those are the foods that can cause bloating and gas and all these things. Interesting thing is that if you keep a person on a FODMAP diet, then they become the chronic relapsing SIBO, bacterial dysbiosis, mycology dysbiosis type of patient, because you're not feeding the microbes in the gut to prevent the overgrowth from reoccurring, right? So when I see providers and they start providing, oh, we're a SIBO clinic, they start selling products for SIBO treatment, and then they give them a FODMAPs diet, they're just trying to keep that patient as a patient. Right. So there's a grift even on, a lot of people want to run from conventional, and I agree with that. I can understand that. But a lot of people are running to this kind of natural or alternative side. And there's a grift on this side. It's like, oh, yeah. So I actually went to a conference a few years ago, and one of these speakers was talking about nicely, correctly, and fantastically about SIBO. Here's the data. Here's what you can do. These are the things you can do. Prescriptions are natural. And then the next day, it was like the chronic relapsing SIBO patient. And I'm like, why are we having a chronic relapsing SIBO patient? It's because we're not changing the microbiome positively. So then we're just in treatment mode, right? And we need to be able to look at, say, can we now fix the gut? And we need to be turning the gut back to normal by feeding the gut what it actually needs to stay and be stable. So endotoxins and LPS, you can look at this lipopolysaccharide. This is an inflammatory trigger that comes from animal proteins and saturated fats. This triggers the leaky gut. So when we have our little, little GI cells here, and I always go through all these pictures with my patients, and this is how your foods are getting absorbed. We have this nice microbiome layer that we actually test with our patients. When we have this increased fecal secretory IgA, we have zonulin elevation, we have different kind of markers of inflammation as well. Then the foods start to leak in, the bad bacteria and other things can leak in, triggering inflammatory problems. And so people can have not only gut inflammation issues, but then they have systemic inflammatory aspects, and they have increased risk of food sensitivities because the body starts labeling even some of the plant foods as being a threat. And so we have to be fixing the gut. It's not just treatment and avoidance of the food, it's actually re-establishing this microbiome, and that's what we do very successfully. But moving people to avoiding the foods that actually contribute to it is one of the strongest things that you need to do to prevent them from relapsing. Plant proteins have fiber. So we just, again, 95% of people not eating enough. Even in my plant world, not eating enough. So they got to eat more. Okay. And I actually have my patients actually make a diet diary for 3 days, calculate, use Google, and search, how much fiber in a bowl of chickpeas, or sunflower seeds, or my pasta, or my blueberries, or my oatmeal, and then calculate it, average out over 3 days, and then increase it by 5 grams per week to get to that 30 grams per day or more. Right? Most people, again, average Americans about 7 to 12 grams, if lucky at 12. And then, my plant-based patients may be about 15, maybe 15 to 20, but they still got to eat more, right? So, but once they get to that eating more, their health will have a huge shift. Again, short chain fatty acids. It lowers the bacterial overgrowth, lowers SIBO, maintains the gut so we can help the leaky gut, not just by giving products. We have products that will fix and heal leaky gut very successfully, but you have to shift the microbiome so it prevents it from reoccurring again, and then you can move on. Right. And again, removing dangerous hormones and toxins from the body. So again, taking out a lot of these excess. If everybody's worried about detoxifying, detoxification is just daily having 1 to 3 well-formed bowel movements a day. Even in cancer patients, for example, women that have estrogen positive breast cancer, those women who have 2 to 3 well-formed bowel movements have the lowest recurrence of their estrogen positive breast cancer. Why? Because those who don't have constipation and the hormone is just recycling, hitting receptors, right? And then another thing about hormones is what I'll talk about here right now is estrogen in those women. So a study came out, and an oncologist was presenting last year. I was at a conference, 3 servings of dairy and 2 pats of butter. 3 servings of dairy a day, right? So having some cheese in my eggs, or maybe a latte in the morning, maybe have a piece of pizza at lunch, and maybe have some Greek yogurt at dinner, or maybe a little bit of ice cream and some pats of butter that's cooked throughout the day in some of these foods, is 40% estrogen and 60% progesterone of a birth control pill daily, right? So when we see women with estrogen positive breast cancer and they're on a hormone blocker like tamoxifen, and then we see the recurrence of that breast cancer continue very high, 50, 80%. And then the doctor says, oncologist will say, hey, take it for 10 years, because they were supposed to take it for 5. And now they're now going from 10 years saying, well, let's go down another 15. Let's take it for 15 years. Why the recurrence rate is not 0? Why shouldn't it blocks the receptor well, but it'd be contraindicated for someone to take a hormone if we're on a hormone blocking therapy, but no one's telling people to stop the food that has the highest amount of the hormone, more than their body, because most women are postmenopausal. In general, that hormone blocks a little bit of their own estrogen, but really what we're getting a lot more from is the environment. Okay. And remember, your immune system's 80% in your gut. So you want to be feeding your gut what's feeding your immune system in a positive fashion. Now, since we're talking about cancer, let's look at the cancer stimulatory or cancer regressive factors of foods. So we look at heterocyclic amines, TMAO, insulin growth factor, NEU5GC, and I'll talk about something really interesting that just came out in the last 2 years is CD36 understanding, okay? And so we have to understand that pro-cancer promoting factors is given, meaning triggered and increased with animal protein and saturated fats. And plants don't have that aspect, right? So that's why when people move towards plant-based diet, again, the risk of cancer, or if they have cancer, we can slow down progression of disease. So let's get into that a little bit more detail. A lot of people will be like, well, I'm eating clean food, Dr. Pai. I'm eating grass-fed wild caught. Because I have patients who come see me and they're seeing other practitioners and they're like, oh, I'm on a keto, paleo diet, a keto diet because I'm trying to starve my cancer out, right, of glucose. But here's the interesting thing is that let's start off from the top here. Heterocyclic amines. So there was a time in America, because we knew that fried food is bad. I've been talking about fried food, too much fried food, right? People are eating just over gobs of too much omega-6s. So they took that fried chicken and said, you know what? Let's go take it to the grill, right? So we're avoiding some of that omega-6, correctly so. Don't get me wrong. And then they moved it to the grill. But when they grill the animal protein and we got those nice little grill marks, that kind of char on the animal protein, that creates what they call heterocyclic amines, and that is pro-carcinogenic. That helps stimulate cancer growth. Okay. Something called TMAO in the last 5 years. This is a lot of research now that's been showing about choline that comes highest found in eggs. Even if they're grass fed and even if they're, free range, still has high amounts of choline. The choline goes to the liver, goes to the microbiome, creates this molecule called TMAO. That is a pro-carcinogenic and inflammatory trigger. So the idea is that, even in a vegetarian who's like, well, hey, I don't eat, beef and pork and lamb and all that stuff like that. I'm just having my dairy and my eggs, right? And they have cancer, that's just fueling potential cancer growth. And again, we're trying to starve cancer, feed the patient, right? But a lot of people are thinking that they're starving cancer, but they're actually feeding it. Insulin growth factor, IGF-1. So cancer cells, and my book covers this in detail, and I always talk about this. You probably see me all over the internet, but cancer cells have about 10 to 12 times more insulin receptors than a normal cell. Cancer cells are hypermetabolic, right? It's trying to grab the patient's energy. That's why over time they start losing weight. They become really tired and fatigued, and they get cachectic, right? It's because the cancer cell is trying to outreach, it's trying to develop new blood supply, it's trying to steal nutrients and energy from the patient, okay? And cancer cells, like idea that cancer was using glucose because like when we do a PET scan, we have the patient fast and then we give them a radioactive tracer and we give them a glucose molecule. We attach that, we inject it in the patient. And then since the cancer cell has 10 times more of those receptors and it kind of sucks it in, it eats that glucose at a higher rate than a normal cell. It's hypermetabolic. What it does, it lights up on the scan. And thankfully, we can say, okay, the cancer is only here. Or unfortunately, many patients like, oh, the cancer was in the prostate, but now it's in the lung. Or the cancer's in the breast, and now it's in their brain. Or, it's spread into their bone, for example. So we're able to look at that based on this activity that the cancer is hypermetabolic. And cancer likes to use glucose simply as its easy source because that's what our body uses for energy. So with that thinking, there was this concept, and in 2008, I was at a conference and I was participating with this group of physicians. They were looking at ketogenic diets, right, in cancer patients, looking at 4 types of cancer, brain and colon and prostate and lung. And when they put them on a ketogenic diet, and this is where the misinformation comes out now, is that the first month, these patients, actually the tumors did show regression a little bit. They were getting a little bit better. Now, why is that? It's because they cut out all the ultra refined processed sugary foods, right? No longer a foot long Subway sandwiches, no all you can eat breadsticks, no candies, no donuts, for example. So we're taking out all that ultra processed food, all the sugary foods, all the food that they shouldn't be eating to begin with. And as we're controlling their blood sugar, as their hemoglobin A1C, their diabetes or their insulin resistance was getting better, the cancer was also shrinking a little bit. It was lowering because it didn't have that easy fuel, right? So when people have diabetes and have cancer, the cancer is actually more active at metastasizing and growing. Just because and so that's why when people have diabetes and they have cancer, they're usually diagnosed, unfortunately, especially if it's an uncontrolled diabetic, at a later stage. It's more aggressive by the time they come in, right? Unfortunately. So getting the glucose down when someone has cancer is super, super important. But that cancer cells regressed for the first month. This is where the ketogenic diet became really popular because at that conference, there was industry and there was some promoters, right, who got paid and funded to take that information and launch it out. Okay, we're starving cancer cells. See, we can see reduction of the cancer growth. But that was misinformation because what happened was after this little honeymoon period, which everybody has a honeymoon period, which is always great, but then we have to see like, what's this long-term marriage happening here? What's the long-term relationship with starving that person of that glucose? There was a flattening. There was no change in the cancer. And then later on, there was exponential growth of the cancer. So initially it was down. Industry took that information and sold it. And they sold books and they sold, I mean, conferences and everybody's keto, keto, keto. But the problem is it started to stabilize and then it started to increase. Everybody just takes this first part of the data. They don't want to tell you the long-term story. Now, when it went up, my thinking was, since I'm the inflammation guy, and that's the area that I focus in on a lot, was like, oh, well, now we're just eating this heavy pro-inflammatory diet, and that's just triggering inflammatory growth, right? Because inflammation makes everything worse. We talked about it. My book talks about it. Now that's all the study in every kind of disease. Everything gets worse with more inflammation. So that's what we thought. But in 2008, they did something really interesting. They took the studies in the animals and they put the animals on a 100% ketogenic diet, right? So we can, a lot of people say that I'm in ketogenic, they're not in ketosis, right? Like that, there's a little bit of that's a whole other lecture. But when they put an animal on a 100% ketogenic diet, so there's no glucose that the animal's cancer cell can utilize, we were thinking, meaning the scientists who did the study, we're thinking like, okay, we're going to just completely shut off its energy. It should starve that cancer and should die. Rightfully so. Makes kind of sense. Interesting thing, the opposite occurred. Slowed, so like same thing that we saw in the humans, cancer cells started to go down, 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 and then started to go up, 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 and the cancer started to spread, started to metastasize. In fact, there was 7 to 10 times more metastasis in the animal model. What they ended up discovering, this is since 2010, that's 2025, and people are still selling this diet, unfortunately, is that cancer cells switch under that stress, metabolic stress, switch its glucose metabolism, because there is no glucose, to use ketones as fuel, right? Cancer cells has been around for millennia, right? In every culture, even Ayurvedic medicine, Chinese medicine, 4,000 years old, they talk about cancer. It's nothing new, right? That cell, those type of cells that go rogue, they have mutations. They have been used to this environment, just like a virus or a bacteria or anything else that we give multiple treatments to. If it's stressed, like the human population now is stressed, and say, for example, with climate change, it's going to get hotter in certain areas and colder in certain areas. We have to, unfortunately, adapt to that. Like I'll probably have to learn how to swim in the ocean sometime. I'm not good at that, but I'm going to have to, right? Because if we don't, then we are destroyed. So then a certain percentage of the population, which is like cancer cells, it learns to adapt. It starts to change. That's why cancer cells get resistant when we give chemo for a long time, or bacteria gets resistant when we give antibiotics over and over again, right? Everything when it's stressed, every organism will start to adapt to try to survive. So the cancer cell starts to survive by now using fuel of ketones. But more importantly, this number down here is something that everybody who has cancer or is eating a high fat diet should understand, that the molecule of CD36 is a receptor that just the last 2 years they discovered in oncology is a receptor on cancer cells. And when we're eating high saturated fats, which is from animal protein, right? So people are like, I'm eating it, even if it's organic, even if it's beef tallow or whatever the craze that's going on right now, is that stimulates this CD36 receptor on the cancer cell. And what that does, that increases and that stimulates the now pathway of how migration and invasion goes in terms of metastasis. We just discovered that the fats is what's triggering the growth and the metastasis of a single kind of cluster of cancer in a nodule or tumor now to spread, right? So this now, so again, I was partially right. It was a lot of pro-inflammatory foods, but what we didn't think of was the other part of the animal protein, which is the saturated fats that come along with it, okay? So IGF-1, insulin growth factor. So since these cancer cells have 10 to 12 times more insulin growth factor, animal protein stimulates insulin growth factor. The number one food that has the highest amount of that trigger is dairy. So if you have a cancer patient or you have someone who has cancer, you want to avoid dairy at all costs. Now, you shouldn't be eating dairy at all. I have a whole discussion on that in my book. And if you have issue with weight or inflammation or mucus producing diseases, you want to avoid those kind of things. But IGF-1 is stimulated. In fact, I think it was 1995 that the publication came out that showed that, out of almost all the carcinogens known to man, that casein, which is the main protein that comes from dairy, stimulates cancer cells to grow the most. So they can put in their studies that they can put a cancer cell in a dish, they can give it all sorts of toxins from the environment, and it takes long periods of time for that cancer cell to develop, right? And that's why we're trying to eliminate toxins out of the environment over time. It's not just a one exposure and you're done. It's like it's over time, like our drinking water, our food supply, our environment. We're trying to clean that up. but you put the dairy protein in a cancer dish or a petri dish with the cancer cell, it starts to multiply because it stimulates that IGF-1 the most, fastest. Okay. The mechanisms of all that is discussed in my book. Now, animal protein, especially when we now look at like what's the worst of the worst, the worst of the worst of the animal protein, aside of the dairy, which we want people to get rid of, and the eggs because of the TMAO and the cholesterol and all these other things like that, is that you want to stop eating, first and foremost, processed meats, because processed meats now are classified as a group 1 carcinogen, right? That means pepperoni and sausage and the deli meats, anything that's when the meat is processed, it's even higher rate of cancer. In fact, class 1 group carcinogen means like it's on equivalence to causing cancer as tobacco, which we know is a class 1, and asbestos, which we know. Right. So like we're actually serving people things like here's a meat lover's pizza or some kind of thing that has layers of this, right? And to increase that risk, there is no data showing that there's no increased risk. So if someone eats processed animal protein, it is increasing risk. It's not like flat. It starts to go up. And by every bite, it goes up. So we're not talking about, oh, I got to eat this large steak or I got to have this big piece of ham or whatever. And so we're talking about like 1.5 slices of bacon, already like 17% increase in colorectal cancer risk. And like people put 4 of those on their cheeseburger. That's now we're adding the cheese, we're adding the beef, we're adding the bacon. Now we're actually adding the French fries, right? So this is all this saturated fat, all this, bad cholesterol, all this pro-inflammatory, no phytonutrients, no antioxidants or little antioxidants, no phytonutrients, pro-inflammatory. So these are the foods that the average person is eating that we have to remove. Okay. So we want to, understand that these are the cancer promoting. So it's not clean. So again, when I say not clean, because this is still in grass-fed, wild-caught, and free range. So even my cancer patients, because I have a lot of cancer patients come in, they see me from these other alternative clinics, and they've been on these diets, and they're coming to me because they're not getting better, and I'm like, well, how's that working for you? And I always tell them, not saying it from a bad perspective, but I'm like, it's not. And the reason is because it still has this. So they're worried about, oh, well, it doesn't have antibiotics, it doesn't have hormones in there. I'm like, but it still has this, right? It's still it's a cancer promoting food. So you want to be eating, this real clean food is cancer preventing as well. It's heart disease reversing. It's diabetes reversing. It's dementia and memory improving. It's microbiome strengthening and immune system strengthening. You don't get the heterocyclic amines. You don't create the TMAO. We don't have the IGF-1. We don't get the saturated fats. Even this NEU5GC, this is interesting. This is a controversial area in the research because as humans, we cannot process this molecule that is in red meat and dairy. Okay. And in a certain percentage of the population, it triggers an immune response, an autoimmune-like response to the protein. It's almost like they're allergic to the meat. Okay. Now, a lot of people say, well, we've been eating this, we've been eating this for a long period of time. And then you look at the rise of autoimmune diseases now going exponentially up. It's because that goes up exponentially with the amount of the animal protein that these people are consuming. So we have to understand that not everybody's going to have this problem, but it is another interesting fact to say, like, if someone has an autoimmune or inflammatory problem, why is their body attacking itself? It might be something that we're giving it that's a trigger to make it very angry. So going back to this slide, the main slide, heme iron and plant iron. Some people don't even know that there was a difference because we all thought iron was iron. In fact, 20 years ago, I thought iron was iron. I didn't know any different either. There's a difference. And especially when it comes to cancer patients, right? This is important because they're one of the population that has anemia, right? Due to the cancer, also due to some of the treatments, right? We give them certain type of chemos, immunotherapies that cause anemia. Some of them have also cancers that are, causing bleeding, like colon cancer, right? So, or they had surgery and they're anemic from the surgery, right? So there's a lot of reasons why people are anemic, but animal protein that has we call heme iron, that's the iron that comes from animal protein, that increases not only the cancer risk, but increases growth, pancreatic, breast, colorectal, and lung, right? So those are like, those are common cancers now, breast, colon, and lung, top 3. We're feeding that. So the bad information that is out there is that even in oncology, even at some of the best places that do some of the best surgeries and have the best treatments available from a conventional standpoint that I might refer my patients or work with, is that they treat the cancer correctly. They're not healing the patient. And when the patient's anemic, they'll tell the patient what you'll always hear is, well, just go have some steak. your count is low. This will help boost it up. Yes, it will boost their hemoglobin hematocrit up because it has the iron. Their iron levels will go up, but it's actually feeding and triggering the cancer growth. Also increases cardiovascular risk, right? When we see the studies like in the 80s and 90s when a lot of alternative clinics used to do chelation for heart disease because they didn't really understand that why it was doing that. But now we understand in that plaque we have heavy metals, right? Iron is one of them. So when they gave them these chelating agents, right? These chelation treatments, it actually improved vascular flow in the studies done even by Medicare, right? So these are like government studies, they're not just alternative clinics. There's like government studies looking at like how we could treat heart disease maybe with IV therapies. But what it was doing is pulling out the iron that's actually in the coronary plaque, right? Because we have like coronary calcium and we have all these other kind of heavy metals. That's what we see now in the scan. That's not the cholesterol, right? So this is important to be actually cutting down. Plant iron doesn't do that, right? So yay. So if someone has anemia, we're just going to have them eat more iron-rich foods, all the greens and beans. So spinach, kale, chard, and all the beans and all those kind of things. Even some of the nuts and some of the seeds have a little bit of iron. So just eating more of a plant-based diet, or they can even take a plant iron supplement derived from plants, won't trigger their growth of cancer and won't increase their cardiovascular risk. Now, the other biggest problem, aside of heart disease, aside of cancer, is blood sugar problems in America. Okay, so when we look at blood sugar problems, we're looking at what they call insulin resistance and advanced glycation end products and intramyocellular lipids. So let's get into that. So animal proteins and saturated fats increase intramyocellular lipids. So what does that mean, that whole world? Intracellular meaning the muscle tissue, internally, and cellular in the cellular level. So when we're younger or we're leaner, for example, there's a little bit of fat in the tissue, but mainly it's a little bit on the outside. But what happens is the animal proteins and importantly the saturated fats as well, we can't forget the saturated fats that comes with the animal proteins, right? Is that over time we get what we call lipotoxicity, is that it actually builds up intramyocellular in the cells of the muscle tissue, this lipids. It builds more fat. And that's why kind of like as you see as our population in the last since the 80s is that we get bigger but we're not getting stronger, right? Our muscles are actually weaker. We just got more fat on our tissues, right? But the problem is that when we have this fat in the tissue, it lowers the effect of the blood sugar going through and being absorbed into the muscle, right? So like when we're exercising, exercise is good, right? Because it helps pull in the blood glucose. That's why if you walk 20 minutes after a meal, for every minute that you walk, 1 point down of your blood sugar. So I tell all my patients if they have a little bit of blood sugar problem or not, hey, if you can, after your meal, just walk around the block. We're not talking about high intensity or low intensity, just take a daily walk. That moving is helping pull in glucose into muscle, right? So instead of just taking your medications, your metformin or your berberines or your natural therapies and all, try to get a little bit more physical exercise. But the more we build this fat tissue, it's harder for the glucose to enter, right? So intracellular lipids increase, right? Insulin resistance, then again, worsening of that's diabetes, weight gain, lower muscle mass, and we get heart disease and all the other comorbidities because blood sugar is the first dominoes. When blood sugar goes up, then you have increased cholesterol, you have increased blood pressure, increased weight. You cannot utilize this excess energy, converts to fats. Advanced glycation end products, AGEs, that's another aspect that is coming from animal proteins. And this is like a pro-inflammatory trigger. These are parts of the foods. Now that we see that we eat more of these things, it increases more inflammation. And these AGEs then cause more degeneration, right? They cause actually aging. And so when we look at this, highest in beef, cheese, chicken, pork, fish, and eggs. And I want to pull this out because this is a big rage now in the alternative communities now that I see is beef tallow, which please don't eat beef tallow, right? Even though they're pushing it a lot. It's high in palmitic acid. And out of all the oils that are out there, okay, and they did a study, I'll show you on the next page, just why even plant-based, you got to be careful of this. Palm oil, which is also palmitic acid, right? Which is highest in beef tallow when you're coming from a saturated fat. So it not only has the AGEs and causes this insulin problem, and it has, again, no phytonutrients and little to no antioxidants and has no fiber, etc. It's pro-inflammatory and all those other things I mentioned before. But palm oil, palmitic acid, It is out of all the oils, they did studies in Europe where they actually were testing in the humans all the different oils, olive oil, avocado oil, sunflower, safflower, corn oil, canola oil, all these things like that, and palm oil. And the interesting thing is palm oil is the one that actually causes this issue more than any other oil. Now, why this is so important? Because palm oil is the cheap oil of the decade, right? And if you look at any animal protein food, if you look at any plant protein food, palm oil is in there, right? Chips and crackers and snack foods and you name it, even plant-based butter or cookies, it all has palm oil. So if you see a chips and it says sunflower, safflower slash palm, if anything has palm in there, I put it away. Even if it's sustainable, organic, harvested, we're not harming the orangutans and all. It's terrible for the environment either way. But more importantly, we see that when they introduce the palm oil into certain countries in the snack foods, and they're eating it normally, their blood sugar problem went up more exponentially because of this issue. So if people are telling you to eat this, then they're actually causing not only the problems I mentioned before, but this is one of the ingredients in that type of oil. So there's other oils that would be better for actually frying. Again, less, please, always the better. But in terms of what is causing my risk of other diseases, a lot of people think that, oh, since this is coming from the animal, that is somehow safer, but it's not. Okay, advanced glycation end products, the higher you eat of those, the higher in all the studies, decreased memory, increased erectile dysfunction. So for all the men who are listening, they have ED, you're eating too much, right? Heart disease, peripheral neuropathy, cancer, inflammation, aging. Again, you want to decrease these things. So when we look at plant proteins, it's just the opposite. We actually can lower intramyocellular because we're not eating the saturated fats, right? But where we have to be careful of for everybody is the palm oil, right? Because people can be plant-based, still eat tons of products that are fried, and still eat a lot of things that have palm oil in it, right? And the AGEs, just like, especially the higher fried foods, especially industrial cooking, is even at a higher level of producing some pro-inflammatory and also pro-carcinogenic promoting factors of even having, say, a potato with the oil cooked at that super, super high temperature. So definitely we need to avoid and decrease as much as possible and avoiding palm oil. I did a series on YouTube you can take a look at, called Healing Spices. But what I did is that, and I'll be doing this more if you're interested in learning about spices and the history of spices and how we can help utilize food as medicine. That's important because we now understand if you go towards a plant-based diet, you still need to have the culinary understanding of how to utilize spices. And the biggest challenge that I have with most plant-based patients and also plant-based providers, plant-based celebrities and chefs and gurus and all is that they don't know how to cook because their standard American diet, now they went plant-based. So it's like, okay, it's kind of raw foods, it's kind of greens and beans and all the G-bomb kind of foods. Great, 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 but it's not flavorful. They don't know how to use. There's 50 spices, and those spices actually decrease AGEs. And when we look at other cultures who are actually eating animal protein, when we give those, and there's studies for this, and that's what I'll be talking about in our podcast, so sign up at our website when they actually give and we utilize spices with those animal proteins, not that I'm recommending people to eat it, but it actually lowers the AGEs because historically other cultures utilized spices as medicine. So they knew just inherently not only to make the food taste better, but they actually knew that there was actually a health benefit to the spices and they would add that to actually improve and lower certain risks. Now, when we look at weight being an issue in the United States, again, animal protein has what we call branched chain amino acids. And you always hear this like, oh, you need to have branched chain amino acids and all these other things. Too much branched chain amino acids increase all of this: diabetes, weight gain, fatigue, blood pressure, heart disease, kidney, liver problems. And the more that you push of the branched chain amino acids, meaning in animal proteins at high amounts, again, 100, 120 grams of animal protein consumed a day, what happens is it lowers their metabolic rate. That's why these people are pounding protein shakes and they're pounding the animal protein at the gym with the trainers, telling them you need to eat more protein, and they can't lose weight. Their metabolic rate is slowing down. They can't utilize and burn those calories effectively. So they're stressed. They're always adding more, and yet they're not getting that aspect. Plant protein is different. Lowers diabetes, lowers the weight, lowers the blood pressure and fatigue, lowers heart disease, improves kidney function. But in the studies, when they actually measure, they have these sports studies now that they do in these centers where they actually put people in chambers and they connect them to all these cool devices, which I think is pretty interesting. But it actually, when they change, so when they do these studies with the animal protein, same amount every day, and they switch it to plant protein and they kind of make everything the same, right? So they're actually, comparing, apples and apples. It actually increases their metabolic rate 14%. So that's why when people go towards a plant-based diet, they actually lose more weight. They always lose weight more than someone who's eating this. Now, there's a little bit of a misunderstanding I'll talk about real quick, is that on plant protein, a lot of people are saying, well, it's incomplete protein. Let's just get over that. That's been debunked now for 10, 15 years in the research, right? There used to be a thought coming out in the 70s, right? That was written in a lay magazine. It was like, oh, we need to mix our proteins that were plants, beans and rice, because it was incomplete, right? Thinking that these foods, since, poor people might be eating it from other, it wasn't the nice big steak that we could afford, so they needed to mix these things. But what our body, now we understand, is that in our microbiome, in our GI tract, we're pooling about 90 grams of amino acids, that whatever food that we're eating, our body's now replacing. And that's why historically, when we look at different cultures who survived and thrived, they weren't eating a mixture. Now, a mixture, don't get me wrong, has more phytonutrients. It's better for the microbiome, makes the food taste better. But there's cultures who just ate wheat as their main, or corn as their main. They weren't, the gladiators weren't, mixing their grains, for example. They were just eating one. And they were fighting, in the Colosseum, right? These are tough, strong people, because they realized that our body can produce, it stores it, so we don't have to mix. I like to mix because we want more phytonutrients. We want more antioxidants. We want a variety. We need 30 different types of foods in a week: vegetables, seeds, fruits, grains, nuts, and legumes, right? To have optimum microbiome function. That's what the data is saying, right? The average person is having about 8 to 10 different, foods, and that we just eat the same thing repetitively. Even in the plant-based world, we're eating too much of the same. So don't worry about, if anybody says, oh, if you go to the gym, if you go to see anything on the online, they're like, oh, this is incomplete. You need, no. Now, is it best to mix? Like, have some cultures here, like I'm from New Mexico, so when we look at Native American culture, and they have beans and rice, and then they have squash, so we're now getting like this full, complete rainbow kind of thing, and we're filling in all the gaps, the three sisters, as we call it. Perfect, that's great, but you can still survive just on one of those if you actually had to. The only food, by the way, that you can't survive on, that doesn't have all the amino acids, that actually has been shown in the literature that you can't live on, is Jello. Right? Which is weird because, what is the first thing they serve you in the hospital for anything is Jello. So post-surgery Jello, cancer patient Jello. I'm like, we're not healing because that's the only food that's been shown that you cannot survive on. So again, try to avoid gelatin, which again, a lot of people are like, oh, I'm taking my collagen protein, which is a gelatin. I'm doing my these kind of collagen products. And again, that's actually the food that is not going to be able to make you survive or live longer. Lastly, I want to get into pesticides, herbicides, heavy metals, antibiotics, and hormones. So when we look at the environment, animal protein and saturated fats have the highest, right? Now, why? It's bioaccumulation, right? So the bigger the fish, I get the heavy metals of all the PCBs, dioxins, and the furans, and all the forever chemicals, which is now found not only in the ocean, even in the mountains, right? Even in these nice, beautiful mountains in New Mexico. People go up to the mountains on the weekends and they want to just go to the river and fish. It's been found there. Like everywhere on the planet, there's forever chemicals now, and there's heavy metals and all these kind of other toxins and microplastics, which I'll speak about. But there's bioaccumulation. So it bioaccumulates as the bigger it is. So when people are having tuna and halibut and all those kind of things, it has more of those concentrated. When we look at then people are saying, well, I only eat grass-fed, I don't eat corn-fed, because we know that all the toxins also store higher in the fat. Everybody wants that juicy fat. They want the fatty, the corn-fed, the juicy steak, So then my clean patients will say, well, I'm eating grass-fed, Dr. Pai. I don't want to eat all that bad stuff. Right. But if you take a look at it, guess what? The grass on these farms, majority of the grass in America is GMO. You think Monsanto doesn't have something called Scott's Division that basically controls the grass in America? This is like a big agri industry. So that animal's now eating GMO grass. So these people are like, I don't want to eat GMO. I'm like, you just have a hyper concentration of GMO. All these toxins and dioxins get stored in the plants. Animals eat it, then we eat the animal, and then we pass it on to our children, right? In our breast milk and our food. All of these things are now, we'll look out. My book will cover this in more detail, but GMOing and all these other aspects. And now we're looking at the rise of antibiotic resistance, right? Just because we have to now control infection, right? In produce. And this is causing a huge issue with superbugs. So animal proteins and saturated fats, unfortunately, that's where it's stored. So collagen, protein, bone broth, that has even more. Even in the organic animal has the highest amount of heavy metals and pesticides because that's where physiologically those things store in the body of an animal is in its bones. So you don't want to be eating bone broth. Don't have collagen broth. If you're a cancer patient, are you trying to say, oh, this is healthy for me? Like that's even if it's organic, I've spoken about this so many times over the last 10 years, and that still seems to be something that people are not getting the information out. Plant proteins, no PCBs, no toxins, no hormones, no antibiotics. Now, you want to be eating organic when you can. Again, organic is the best. But for those people like most of us who are on a budget, I tell people go to EWG, type in Dirty Dozen, on the Google, and then you want to find here's the top 12 foods that are the most heavily sprayed. Those are the foods that you should buy organic. Why? Because it's risk reduction. In my practice, it's risk reduction. It's not perfection. In a perfect world, organic is best. If you can afford it, you have access, great. Please do. Great. I love it, right? But in the reality of things, where most people live in food deserts or they're kind of limited of what they can afford based on the economy and based on how much cash they have in their pocket, then what I look at is like, want to make sure that you are eating those top 12 foods because you want blueberries and you want peppers and you want potatoes and you want carrots and you want, anything that's on the list, apples and all, but you want to make sure if it's organic, because if it's on the list, you're getting more toxins. So we want those only positive attributes and we want to cut down some of this environmental aspects. We also want to make sure that you are washing your food. A lot of people think that just because it's organic, they don't have to wash it. It's a weird concept. But remember, all the food has been handled by hundreds of people. It's fallen on the floor. It's been touched. When I go to the store, we're all checking how this is feeling, how that's feeling. We're looking at the fruit and the vegetables and all. And sometimes they put it back on the shelf, right? So you got to make sure you wash your food, okay? Because a lot of people, they just think they can just eat it, especially when it's in the store. Probably eat it from the farm, by the way, but from the store, it's a little bit different. So please wash your food. And then plastics. You want to avoid plastics. Even the animal protein people, you want to avoid plastics. This is a big problem because we are microwaving stuff with plastic film, right? Even vegan meals can be in a plastic container, right? Or I just went yesterday, I went to a vegan Asian restaurant, one of my favorites, but they put the food in this black plastic container, and the studies show that the black plastic containers actually leach more of these PFOS and PFOS out more than any other container. So I had to tell them, like, you need to switch to these kind of just regular recyclable cardboard containers that they had before, right? So this is something that, again, all of us are getting exposed. Microplastics is everyone's problem, plant or animal, right? We're all getting exposed to. If you haven't seen or read about this, is that they did find this number of tiny bits of plastics found in humans' brain increased from 2016 to 2024, right? The highest of those found with those with dementia, and they find that they have the amount of plastic as much as a plastic spoon. This is terrible, people. This is one of the other contributing factors of chronic diseases is now environmental toxicity. How many of us drank bottles of water? I see my patients go, unfortunately, they go because they don't have a filter in the house. They think it's cheaper or they don't know what to do. So they go to the big box store and they have cases and cases of bottled water. 1 liter of bottled water has 240,000 nanoparticles of plastic. And they're drinking dozens and dozens, and I'm telling them, hey, drink 8 glasses of water a day. And some people are carrying all this water around, or we're getting these meals and we're cutting these little holes and we microwave it, and then all that microplastic just drips back into the food. Now there's something what they call the double Trojan effect, is that when we add all the heavy metals, antibiotics, pesticides, herbicides, and then we have microplastics, it's the carrier now. So the microplastic is not only just carrying xenoestrogens and other toxins just from the plastic material, the PUFAs, PFAs, and all those other, PET chemicals, PET chemicals. It is also binding to these environmental toxins, and that's another way that we get it into our body. So again, decreasing and cleaning out the environment. Now, when we look at, well, what about food? Whose food is cleaner? Well, the highest levels of microplastics in all the studies, seafood is the highest. Obviously, why? Because it's in the ocean, and the bottom feeders are eating most. So some of the things that people thought were like the exclusive, expensive foods, like shrimp. Shrimp is a bottom feeder. It eats all the stuff off the bottom of the ocean. And unfortunately, all this stuff, when it breaks into microplastic, sinks to the bottom. Right? So when people have like fish sticks, which is commonly eaten every day in schools and hospitals, people eat fish sticks and breaded shrimp, even Gulf shrimp, minimally processed. It's because it's still the shrimp. It's like, this is the problem. Seafood, which used to be an expensive food, is the highest in microplastic. Beef, pork, chicken. Why? Because that animal's consuming. One thing with microplastics that people forget is that every time we throw away plastic, so these are not necessarily like cooked in it, right? it's not like they're microwaving it in the plastic, is that every time we throw away plastic and it goes eventually to the ocean, because that's what we do in America, we send it to other countries and they just dump it in the ocean. We're guilty, but they do it. We look the other way. We pay them to do that. It breaks down into the ocean and then through evaporation goes back up in the atmosphere and then it rains down. So why we see microplastic in everyone and in all food is because of rain, right? It's not purposeful. It's not like, oh, there's someone's poisoning us, right? This is just an environmental worldwide problem of contamination. So lowest foods is going to be plant proteins. So vegetables still have it. So even my organic tofu, even though it has all these health benefits, still has microplastic. But it has a lot less than the animal proteins. And another thing, like here's bottled water, milk and soda. Again, it's just full of the water that is, we don't filter out microplastic, right? And they actually put this in plastic, right? Jugs of milk, jugs of soda, and bottles of soda. Chicken nuggets at 300 microplastic per nugget. And even weirdly, the plant but nuggets also were also guilty. So I want to make sure that, again, eating more whole foods is better than sometimes like, well, let me get a plant nugget. Well, I don't know about the plant nugget because whatever else they're mixing with it, it still has some microplastic. Unfortunately, now honey, this is the bees, poor little bees that, they're using so much glyphosate in sprays that this is affecting. They're actually finding the microplastic stuck on them now, unfortunately, right? This is terrible for everybody. It's terrible for pollination. And, 80% of the crop now, as you've probably read in the last few weeks, of the bee hives worldwide is now down. So we're going to have this like kind of like a potential collapse because bees are the pollinators. Of about $15 billion of US economy, food is by bees. And then interesting thing here, this is something that I always tell patients all the time, sea salt. Right. So, people go like, oh, I'm having my French fries at the restaurant and they say it's served with sea salt. Sea salt is just, we're opening the ocean, we're letting it dry in the flats, and then we scrape that up. That has microplastic. So if you're someone who's putting sea salt on your food, what I would do is I would look at getting more of the mine salt, like the Himalayan salt. However, there was a study showing that some of the Himalayan salt actually had it. We're like, well, how can a mine salt have it? And it was coming from Pakistan. And the study showed that the salts that were coming from Pakistan were actually adulterated. They were actually just ocean salt with pink coloring. So I have to be careful. Like there's levels of like grifting in the food industry, in the drug industry, in the environmental. Everybody's trying to sell something that, if they can give it to you cheaper, always step back. And if something is cheaper than you think it should be, it might be suspect to something that is wrong with that. So lastly, what I want to just come back to this slide, right? So animal proteins and saturated fats, pro-inflammatory, and they increase all these problems, and they have higher contamination problems and heart disease and cancer risk and all this stuff, lacking no phytonutrients and no antioxidants, a little antioxidants, no fiber, for example. And plants are different. They have phytonutrients, fiber, they help your microbiome diversity, they lower blood sugar, they don't have cholesterol, they lower inflammation. You can get them cleaner. You don't have to worry about so much of the toxins, but still there's some in there. We're not free of it. But it prevents, treats, and reverses diseases. And these actually have not been shown. I mean, there's no study. Again, like we don't see a study showing that eating animal protein will reduce your cancer, or eating chicken will reduce your breast cancer, or eating beef will reduce your Alzheimer's disease. There's no studies. Now, there's always comparative studies where some of the animal protein companies will compare themselves to the other one, right? So beef is better than pork. That industry will sell that. And then the fish industry will say, well, or the chicken industry say, we're better than beef and pork. And then the fish industry say, we're better than all three of these other ones, right? So they're not comparing themselves to the gold standard. So you want to be eating the gold standard. Why? Because you deserve to have optimum health, right? There is no drugs that we give at the end of the day. I tell patients, did your doctor prescribe any of these things in a pill form to prevent, treat, or reverse the disease? No, we're giving drugs and biologics and immunotherapies and cancer drugs and blood pressure drugs and cholesterol drugs and pain drugs and bowel regimen drugs, all because we're eating these foods. We're not giving these things to help prevent or treat or reverse diseases. And when we look at eating them or even providing them in a supplemental form, again, whole foods better, this is what we want to be eating more of, right? So going back, this is the slide. All you need to know at the end of the day is you want to be eating more towards this, eating less towards that. And anytime you hear anything going forward, now just go back to this chart. I always have people print this out, put it on the refrigerator door, and just say, okay, I read something, I heard something. Where am I falling? Is it on this side? Because there's going to be subtle nuances. They're going to try to convince you as much as they can to do this, but really at the end of the day, you want to do this. Now, what I want to end with is this. I want to give you an example, because what I see every day is a lot of cancer patients. 60% of my practice is cancer patients. The rest are chronic inflammatory, autoimmune, and people who want to just get optimum health. So there's a grift that we see a lot where patients are running from conventional into alternative medicine. And I'm not an alternative medicine provider. I'm an integrative medicine provider. What that means is that we are evidence-based, right? We look at the data, and sometimes we need to do this. Sometimes we don't want to do that. We're always trying to reduce the risk by using, evidence-based practices, less invasive, cost-effective, more dietary lifestyle, kind of incorporating a lifestyle medicine, but also using the approach of mind-body medicine, looking at also aspects of herbal medicine, looking at traditional indigenous medicines like Ayurvedic medicine and Chinese medicine and acupuncture. So we're looking at a little bit of everything, taking the best of everything. But here's an example I want to show that there's a group of people that I just saw recently, and I had a patient that came in. Unfortunately, he didn't do well because he was already at the end stage. He came very late. He had stage 4 colon cancer. He was 35. He was already on a paleo keto diet, and he was following a practitioner that is promoting this. And he was like, "Oh, they're trained and they test, assess, address, and don't guess." And they, had all that nice little acronym of stuff. And they're like, "Oh, we're all evidence," and all this stuff. And this was the actual. I actually took these images, and this is from the colon cancer awareness newsletter that this patient brought in. He's like, "This is what," he brought it in, and he was kind of like following it, but he wasn't doing well. And he just said, "This is what I'm eating. I just want to show you what I'm eating," right? And I'm like, "Okay, well, let's just take a look at this." Well, I said, "Okay, well, here's a half a cup of Parmesan cheese. Oh boy. 2 ounces of melted butter. Here we go. 1 egg, 3 tablespoons of butter, 8 ounces of bacon, 5 eggs, a fourth of a cup of heavy cream, a half a cup of mozzarella cheese." This is, and even the processed meat here is a risk of colon. It's a type 1, group 1 carcinogen, right? And again, but they're pushing, "Oh, you need to starve your cancer. This is all we're using. We're not using regular flour. We're using almond flour. We're trying to be gluten-free." Again, this is the grift that people have to understand that's being sold. People are trying to market then alternative cancer therapies by saying, "Well, hey, don't go get chemo, but then, eat this and then get my IVs," for example. And this is bad information. It's misguided. It's misinformation. In my opinion, it's negligent. It's also malpractice. If you just saw this slide here, you can easily look at it and say, "Hey, after watching this, how is this benefit for anybody that has cancer?" Right? So anyways, I just wanted to end on that because I want people to understand, like, this is what we deal with every day. People are getting so much misinformation, and these are by providers. These are people like, "Here's some recipes." Okay, it's great. People want something to do. I don't blame them. They get all in because, "Hey, I heard Brussels sprouts are great for you." Yeah, Brussels sprouts are great for you, but we just negated all the benefits of everything that they're taking by all these pro-inflammatories, cancer-promoting, heart disease, diabetes-promoting type of foods, immunosuppressive foods. So at the end of the day, you want to be leaning, again, much as you can, eating more plant-based and reducing the animal proteins. And to remind everybody, to sign up for our evidence-based podcast called Take Back Your Health, go to Sanjevani, SANJEVANI.net, and sign up, or sanjevanistore.com. We also have the book, and we have our Bosmeric on sale. You can get a signed copy of the book available. I'm available for integrative medicine, health coaching consultations via Zoom, or you can come in for an official consultation in person, and you can make an appointment, and you can take a look at our website. I highly recommend everybody grab a copy of the book just to start there as a primer. Get used to just changing a little bit. It's not about perfection, it's about reduction. But if you start reducing your risk, that's the easiest way to bring yourself to wellness. All right, anybody else? Let me just take this off. Let me see. Okay.
You all set?
Yeah, I'm all set. I'm just going to stop the share. Just want to see if everybody can see this. Okay. Contact information, everything's there. Okay, great. Let me stop the share. Okay.
All right. Yeah, so great. Thank you so much for that informative presentation. Really appreciate it. So you gave everybody your contact information and where to get your books. So I think they're good there. So appreciate that. So we'll just jump right into the questions. So you were talking about omega-3s, and you were talking about plant-based sources for omega-3s. saying that the fish oils, et cetera, aren't a healthy source. So you mentioned walnuts, flax, et cetera. Dr. Furman talks about there being issues with the things like flax to get your omega-3s because a lot of people have issues converting EPA to DHA. What are your thoughts on Furman's assertion?
So I don't know about Furman, but I test my patients. So I put it where the test, right? So if someone just says you have trouble with converting, that means they're reading old data and they're not testing. I'm evidence-based, so I'm not going to sit here and sell a plant-based oil, even though I consulted for the largest company that brought those ideas to the country. Don't get me wrong, right? But I think Dr. Furman's selling a plant-based oil, right? So that's coming from a place of like, well, don't take supplements, but you don't convert, so take mine. That's a little okay. I'm going to be like, wait, I question that because not every patient does not convert. That's old information that the industry, which I consulted for, by the way, propagated, right? Because the goal was, and before got into that, even consulting into that industry, I was like, oh, even my vegan patients, I used to convince them, before I was even plant-based, we were everybody was doing fish oil, right? Because that's the cheapest, easiest source. Then we started looking at the purity of it. I actually had a company that was actually batch testing, and they would put a number on the bottle, and then you can actually look at the batch test. Because what people don't realize is that most companies now they'll say, "Oh, we have heavy metals. We test for heavy metals and environmental toxins." It's a test done once a year, and they've had a billion batches of fish, which the ocean is constantly changing, right? Every spill, every month, we're dumping more in the ocean. So a little bit like when people go to the big box stores, it's like anybody that says it's fish that is clean and all, the data would show that it's not true. Second thing is we started to see is that there was even people like in my book I wrote about like salmon oil because everybody thinks, well, hey, salmon, we want to eat wild caught salmon's high in omega-3s. And so like what I showed in my book is that there's facilities out in Asia, South Asia, right, where is where they do a lot of this stuff, is they would grow the salmon in tanks, feed it antibiotics, feed all this stuff like that. And they give it what they call a carotenoid, and this one comes from shrimp shells. But we know astaxanthin, right? Astaxanthin comes from microalgae. That's why we can get it as a plant source, right? But it's easy for that industry because it's like a waste product from the shrimp industry. They get the shrimp shells, they grind it down, and it has a high rich carotenoid, that really pinkish, strong, antioxidant color. Okay, they add it to the tank. So when the fish eats it, it turns their gray flesh because they're farm raised. They're not eating the phytonutrients in the ocean. They're getting all that waste. You don't want to hear that, but there's a whole story of what they feed them, and then it turns this gray flesh to pink. Then what they do is they take it to the bank of the river because that's where these little cages and these factory farms are, and they drop the fish in the river, and then like about 50 to 100 feet later, they pick it up with this machine, and now it's wild caught, right? And so then when people go to the store and they go, gosh, I see this 120 bottle of soft gel of like 500 milligrams of EPA and DHA, of the fish salmon oil, and it's $12 or $10. I'm like, but if you go to a restaurant and you get a fillet of wild caught fish, right? You're almost paying that much just for one fish or
Right.
more, actually, right? So but it's too cheap. Like how can you get, because you have to understand like how much fish is needed to squeeze out and process to get those omega-3s is a lot. So we test in all our patients. And the funny thing is, although we do offer plant-based oils, right? Because I did the consulting for that, is that we test because the idea is that for me, I'm trying to reduce as many supplements so that when I do recommend a supplement, it's for a targeted reason. It's not just because I think they need it. It's because I can show that it's either deficient or more importantly, they're not converting. If they're not converting, I still have them eat flax, chia, hemp, and walnuts because they still need the protein and the fiber, right? It's just that if they're not converting, then taking a plant omega-3. But to me, that's a misguidance. And I'll get slack for this, but guess what? I stand on the data. It's a slack because I test. So I put my money where my mouth is. So other people just sell. I'm not a seller. I'm a teller. I tell the truth. This is the truth about health. So I'm telling the truth about health. Some people are grifting in a way, right? I might get slack as, oh my God, he's plant-based, he's saying this. I'm like, no, that's just what it is. We test it. And so if a patient comes back, that delta 60 saturates is impaired, then yes, a plant-based oil is better than a fish oil, right? Because it's cleaner, it's more sustainable for the planet, so all these other benefits. Now, it is a little bit more expensive, unfortunately, because to get that high dose, especially a patient that has a lot of inflammation, to get a higher dose of EPA and DHA in them, we need to take more. That's the offset. And that's where the industry is having still trouble of getting plant oils into the marketplace. But I'll give you an example. With the company and this is interesting to talk about, but the company that I consulted with, They were the largest fish oil company selling in Canada, the purest, when they batch tested each bottle. When they introduced the plant version, that time, it became the number one seller in Canada, more than the fish. That is their goal, right? Because people always will say, well, hey, if it didn't cost anymore and it's safer for the environment, safer for me, and good, people will make the better decision. Everybody's trying to be more sustainable. Why not? Right? The challenge is that company got bought out by another company. That company owns 8 other divisions of supplement brands in the United States. Then, after I published my book, they blocked the importation of the plant oil into the United States because they didn't want to hurt the other portfolio. Now it's available because things change and the market shifted and people are moving for plant-based sustainable options. That's why Furman can sell it now and all these people can get it. But it's not that they invented it. It's just the idea is that we want to make sure that if we recommend it, because everybody's talking about supplements are bad, you need to be eating whole foods. So we need to test and see what's deficient and then have them either increase it in the diet if they can.
So just two quick things. One of Furman's patients is saying that he recommends testing first. So he agrees with you on that. So just a real quick question. Do you see a large percentage or a meaningful percentage of your patients having an issue, or if they're getting enough in their diet, enough?
So I wish this would be a great thing. I wish we wouldn't have to test, right? I wish there was a characteristic or something else that we could do that would normally be like, okay, you're doing this other blood test, and we know based on this that you're not converting. That'd be fantastic, but we can't. There's no characteristic or attribute, I wish, that we could say that person doesn't convert, right? Because it's always in the person that I don't expect, which is unfortunate, right? And from the other perspective, it's like, a lot of people will say, Dr. Pai, you're telling me that I don't need this thing. I'm like, yeah, you don't need that. You need to eat more of this. Because we measure, like, it's not just are they converting, when we're measuring their ALA from their diet, flax, chia, hemp, if it's low and their EPA and DHA is high, that's because they're taking a fish oil or they're eating fish or they're getting a plant source of the pill. But we can also assess, are they getting enough? Because a lot of people think like, oh yeah, I do eat walnuts or I do eat chia seeds or flaxseed or hemp seeds or edamame. But then we measure, it's like you're not eating enough. Right. So there's a little bit of like, we can also guide them to eat more if they're eating it and thinking like, well, how do I know? Well, everything in my practice, since we're evidence-based and I'm a data-driven guy, is like, I need to measure that. Just like we measure their cholesterol, just like we're measuring their cancer cell markers, just like we're measuring their blood sugars. Like we have to see where they're at because biochemistry is slightly different in everybody, and not everybody responds as easily. That's the challenge with plant-based diet. Like for every 9 people that are like, oh my God, I lost weight, and there's gonna be one person like, I did all this and I didn't lose weight, and my blood sugar is still very high. Right. And then we have to start looking at like food sensitivities, microbiome, nutrition. Like that's why we look at everything in every patient because we're all biochemistry different. We're all unique individuals. And there's a factory medicine, even in plant-based world, like everybody just gets the same thing. But then there's, what I start seeing is I start seeing a subsection of patients where they are plant-based and they're stuck. So
So just
there's the average person coming in like they haven't changed anything. They don't know. This is all new, but they're willing to change. And there's other people like who, they're on it. They've read Furman's books, which is great, by the way. And they're already eating. Yeah, it's great. Don't get me wrong. Like, I don't want to bag on anybody's moving healthier, but when they get stuck, then now they start looking at, and that's my kind of expertise. Like, what is the trigger that's still causing dysfunction? What is the deficiency or toxicity that is still causing an imbalance, that is causing them not to have that optimum health or that optimum achievement, which other people get that they still want to achieve?
All right, so just to close the loop on the omega-3 conversation, just real quickly, what I'm hearing is you tend to focus on making sure they get enough omega-3. The conversion, if they're getting enough, usually isn't a major issue based on what you've seen in the blood work. Is that yes or
Well,
no? Is that
most people are not eating enough. That's
right?
the first
But if
point.
they were, and I don't want to I want to move on to other questions,
Yeah, go ahead.
but I just want, but so if they were getting enough, then you think the conversion issue is a non-issue?
No, because we'd have to test.
Okay.
Yeah,
Um,
because here's the thing is like when people are complaining in the industry of like people are taking too much supplements, well then, when they test, it's like, are you going to be taking something every day for every month for every year of your life? If you don't need to, why should you? Even if it's plant-based, right? Like we have to be putting everything to the test, and if they need it, then that's an important extra expense that is important for their health, and we can then measure that and justify that. But if we just say that just haphazardly, I think that's misguided on any level.
So we had a speaker on earlier who was a vegan for a while and then I guess, was still having some issues. I think he was plant-based. When I say vegan, I mean like whole plant-based.
Okay.
And he was saying that after 4 years, he had some medical issues, and he was instructed to go on, and he was a doctor himself, but he was instructed to go on animal products or animal protein to get enough protein. And he said something that I was a little surprised about, which is that he was actually protein deficient, but going on the animal products actually fixed his issue, like eating meat actually fixed his issue. What are your thoughts on that? Are there times, first of all, are there people who need to eat meat? That's really, I guess, the question I'm
So
asking.
I would say that there's not people that need to eat meat. Is there a lot of people who think they need to eat meat? Absolutely. Yeah, there's a whole industry, right? We got fast food industry, we got burgers, we got chicken wings, we got steakhouses. I'm like, yeah, they're pushing this thing. People say, oh, I need it, I need it. I'm like, look, here's the chart I showed you. Which one you lean to? Because if it's working for you, then how like why are you here seeing me? They're not usually doing better. They're not really feeling good, right? They're sick and tired of being sick and tired. But we have to be careful of people also mis-selling, right? So I have to look at the masses. Is there an N of one of everything? Yes. There's always going to be someone who smoked and lived till 100. But the majority of people who smoke will eventually die from cancer or some other contributory secondary issue of the cancer, right? Of smoking, right? So yes, there's going to be this one person who just did this or did this. Fine. But that's not the 99% of people. I want to follow what the data is. And so if they can justify, but here's the thing is I have patients all the time, paleo, keto, and they don't do well. Like then when they come in, like they don't do well. Right? In the beginning, it's like, but that weight loss, don't get me wrong, they feel good. Just like someone taking Ozempic or something like that. They'll have this weight loss in the beginning because they're not eating, they're starving themselves, right? So there is some benefit at the very beginning because what they've learned is let me cut out some of this junk carbs, this fast food, so they kind of switch. But when they go this heavy pro animal protein diet, I was like, most people come see me just at the end of the day have problems and they want to get better. And it's a lot of confusing information. And I never blame a patient because there's so much misinformation. Even this guy right there was telling, well, I got to go back and I need it. I'm like, well, then you don't understand your microbiome. You might think it is, but I would take any person like that because I've had there's people like on the internet and social media people who used to be like hardcore carnivore diet people, right? They were just only right. And I'm like, okay. And they were like heavily had followers and followers. And then like you don't see them anymore. Why is that? Because when you look later on, there's an obituary down the line. Like they died from cancer or they died from a heart attack. Or like that's just, it's not the same that no one deserves it, by the way. Like no one deserves that, right? But the idea is we get fed because we get this, we want our cake and eat it too. No, this hard discussions like we're 64 in chronic disease. We spend $4.3 trillion America's not doing well. We're an inflammation nation. That's all it is and we have to reduce it. I'm not perfect. I'm going to tell you. I have not eaten animal protein because I have other personal issues with animals and environment and stuff like that. But for all my other patients, like there's a holiday, there's a travel day, you're stuck in the airport. I'm not there to judge that. We're moving the ship. Have I reduced their risk? If their A1C and their lipids and all these things are well within the normal limits, who am I to say anything? They have reduced their risk. It's not about perfection. It's about reducing risk. And once you reduce risk, life is easy. But what happens is a lot of people want to get super hyper vigilant in one thing, plant-based only, no salt, no oil, no sugar, and they still get cancer, by the way, right? And then there's patients that have done that we've seen all the time because there's other issues with microbiome. There's stress, there's environment, there's toxicities. Diet's super important, don't get me wrong, but you got to do the epigenetic changes. So when I have 10 steps in my book, the reason why there's 10 steps because you have to look at all these epigenetic changes, diet, lifestyle, environment, and belief system to actually change those in a positive nature. You don't have to be a master of one. You have to just improve your odds and lower your risks of all of them.
Great. So you talked about blood sugar, and Brian Clement is one of the speakers from Hippocrates, and he talks about avoiding sugar. I'm sorry, not sugar, avoiding fruit, because of the sugar content in it. And he says that it feeds cancer. What are your thoughts on that claim?
I think it's a bogus claim.
Okay.
What I would say is this, look, anybody that has an institute that does juicing and say, don't eat this, don't that, just publish the data. Like you have hundreds of patients or thousands of patients over decades that people spend thousands of dollars. Because I see people who come to these places, by the way, right? So they come back because they're not getting better, right? That's not biologically, because where are they getting all their phytonutrients from?
Right.
Are they
I
getting
guess
30 grams of
he would
fiber?
say, he would say
We
sprout.
can't just be eating sprouts all day long. Just letting you know,
Right.
like that's not a sustainable real. Are the blue zone people doing that? Are the people who live the longest? Like people have to step back and start looking and even criticizing our own little field, right? And saying like, well, who has the financial gain here, right? Are they a sponsor of this conference? Think of that. Follow the money.
Right.
I'm gonna get in trouble. Probably won't get invited next year. But this is
No,
what
no. Well, he's not a
this,
sponsor of the conference, but
yeah, well, look at the last couple of years, right? So,
he
right,
has been.
right. So you have to just look at that, right? I'm not trying to bag on anything. Every industry, like even my integrative conferences I go to, there's an industry, right? Like there's food industry still, there's salmon industries. I went to a conference once. I'll just be honest, right? I went to an integrative conference, right? With no drug talk is is a CME conference, but it was salmon for breakfast, salmon for lunch, salmon for dinner. They had salmon souffle, salmon mousse, and the Wi-Fi password was salmon. So don't tell me we're not influenced like by some industry, right? And understandable. We all need
Right.
sponsors. I'm not the one to say like we can't do anything for free. That's why we still need public television. Still needs to get sponsors, right? We still need sponsors, but we have to also follow the money. It's like if everybody just juiced and got better, then every place would be juicing and telling everybody like there's a little bit of like the grift in one way, in my opinion, is that people are trying to run from this and go to this. It's like, just follow this chart. Are you eating more of this and eating less of that? It's not cancer is not just simple as avoiding sugar. If someone just tells you like, don't eat glucose, then that's really reductionist thinking and having very little experience or understanding of anything that I just talked about.
All right, great. Well, that concludes our time. I appreciate your time with us today and all the information that you shared. Can we unmute the audience?
Oh
Please.
my gosh.
Thank you, Dr. Pai.
So much.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you,
Pai.
Dr.
Okay.
Pai.
Thank you, Dr.
Real
Pai.
quick.
Thank you, Dr. Pai.